Hello, thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to be here to celebrate the opening of Into the Modern here at the National Gallery of Singapore. So I'm really delighted to be able to take some time today with Phoebe to discuss the approach and our thinking around shaping this exciting exhibition for the audiences here. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the organization of the show as a whole and how that came out of an existing exhibition project to really create a unique presentation for the audiences here in Singapore. And then I'll also highlight a few particular examples of certain sections of the show and how we reshaped the story around these artists and these artworks, and in particular drawing out some of the elements of the exhibition design and how that impacts your experience of the show. So this exhibition is really drawing on the foundations of the deep Impressionist collection in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. We were founded as a museum in 1870, opened our doors in 1876, and by the 1880s, early Bostonian collectors were traveling to France and purchasing Impressionist paintings directly from those art dealers who represented artists like Monet, Renoir, Degas, and others. And so they would then return, of course, to Boston and soon begin lending these works to the MFA. And so as early as 1892, we had works by Monet on the walls of the galleries in the museum. So the collection of these works by these local collectors really deeply impacted our own holdings from very early on because, of course, many of these paintings eventually became gifts and bequests to the collection, which now form the core of our Impressionist holdings. So in particular, while we have kind of a wide range of Impressionist works in our collection, our kind of largest claim to fame is our whole collection of Monet in particular. We own 35 oil paintings by Monet, 17 of which are on view right now in Singapore, so you're very lucky to have such a huge part of our collection here. And so it's really kind of one of the most foundational parts of our Impressionist collection as a whole. As curators, we're constantly reevaluating the stories that we tell in our galleries, whether it's through different groupings or different juxtapositions of specific artworks. I'm constantly, updating wall labels and exhibition texts when there's new research that becomes available or our thinking starts to shift on a particular subject or artist. And we do the same kind of things when we're planning exhibitions. Since an exhibition, like Into the Modern, it's inherently a way to tell a story about a group of artworks. We're thinking broadly about our Impressionist collection as a whole, and then trying to draw out different themes and ideas that pull together different works in compelling ways. And so for Into the Modern, this was a particularly unique opportunity to rethink what was an existing project in a new way here in Singapore. So this exhibition was originally formed out of a partnership that the MFA had with the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. And the show opened in Melbourne in June of 2021, but unfortunately had to close just 3 weeks into its run due to COVID lockdowns in the state of Victoria. And in that version of the exhibition in Melbourne, the exhibition was really highlighting our Impressionist collection through the lens of the friendships and the connections between the members of the Impressionist group. We had some sections focused on groupings of artists and their interactions, mentorship with one another, and then other sections focused more significantly on one singular artist. And so then since that unfortunate run in 2021 that didn't quite go to plan, we made new arrangements with the National Gallery in Victoria to send exactly that same exhibition back to them this past June of 2025 so that their audiences could have a fuller opportunity to see the show. And so it was during the course of planning the second iteration of the show for Melbourne that the opportunity arose to form this partnership here with the National Gallery of Singapore. But in beginning those conversations about the project, it became clear that we really wanted to craft a new narrative to introduce our Impressionist collection to the Singaporean audiences in a different way. And so it was really a kind of unique challenge to take more or less the exact same group of paintings, but reframe them to underscore a different story here in Singapore. Here we go. Okay. So when you think of Impressionism, many people kind of identify Impressionist painting more broadly as these, beautiful landscapes filled with the fluttering brushwork and dappled light, vibrant color. and which in a sense, many of these paintings do fulfill those thoughts. But there's many stories beneath the surface that speak to the thoughts, the feelings, the concerns of the time in which these artists lived, the impulses that were pushing them towards certain subjects and helping them develop this novel approach to their style of painting. The late 19th century in France was a period of turbulent changes, transformational changes across all facets of life, whether it was in the urban landscape, social and political changes, technological developments. And so some artists responded to these changes quite directly in their paintings, others in much more subtle ways, and sometimes not in visible ways at all in terms of what they were painting on the surface of the canvas. But these really transformative social, cultural, kind of technological shifts that were happening across France impacted each and every one of these artists. They were living, breathing artists reacting to the world that was changing around them. And so we wanted to consider this and how we reframed the story for this presentation here in Singapore. And so this formed the organizing framework around how we organize this group of works for display here. So I don't have time to talk through the entirety of the show and how we reshaped all of the different sections for the news story that we're telling here in Singapore. So I'm just going to highlight two particular sections of the show to give some examples of how we utilized this artwork in conjunction with elements of the design in particular to emphasize different parts of the narrative. So the first example I want to highlight is focused on our display of Renoir's iconic painting, Dance at Bougival, which is the work you can see farthest to the right on this slide. Nearly life-size, Dance at Bougival is one of three full-length paintings of dancing couples that Renoir painted in 1882 and 1883, and it's considered truly one of his greatest masterpieces of his entire career. In Melbourne, we had a focus section devoted on just Renoir alone as a singular figure. We were highlighting his painting Dance at Bougival in context with his landscapes and his other figural works from our collection. It was also underscoring the fact that this period in the early 1880s was one of great experimentation for the artist. He wrote to his art dealer, Durand Ruel, in 1881, saying that, "I'm suffering from the illness of experimentation." His works from these years really show the range of pictorial effects as his painterly approach was evolving in different ways stylistically, going from his very distinctive, loose, fluttery brushwork in some of the landscapes, like you can see here on the bottom, to a much smoother, more finely modeled type of style that you see in Dance at Bougival. So in Melbourne, the exhibition design was used to create this really immersive experience and to evoke the feeling of a late 19th century French interior with these boldly colored walls, the decorative gold molding, and this very dramatic chandelier hanging from the ceiling. This effect also emphasized Renoir's decision in the late 1870s to actually stop exhibiting his work with the Impressionist group, but to show his work at the Paris Salon, which was the annual state-sponsored exhibition in Paris. And so here in Singapore, we've reframed this iconic painting in a completely new context. It forms the centerpiece of a section which we've called Modern Encounters, which is considering the ways that the physical transformation of Paris, which took place in the latter half of the 19th century, contributed to changes in the social and cultural spheres as well. The city of Paris itself underwent dramatic changes as the Baron Haussmann led this urban revitalization project in which the grand boulevards, the multi-story apartment buildings, these great long vistas that now define the city center of Paris were really created out of the kind of historical, more medieval type of neighborhoods that Paris used to exist of. And so we're considering how these physical changes to the urban landscape contributed to these changes in the social classes, the role of women and their opportunities, and new venues for entertainment and leisure in the urban sphere. And so in this new context, we've contextualized Dance at Bougival with works by his peers such as Monet, Degas, and Raffaelli, who you can see on the screen here. So placing it within the context of these changing cultural and social spheres in the late 19th century. These other artists who were also capturing this changing landscape of the world around them in the urban city center. There were new venues for urban and suburban leisure and recreation, from the theater and the racetrack to cafes and these outdoor restaurants in the outskirts of Paris, which is the setting for Dance at Bougival. So this really enabled us to consider Dance at Bougival in a broader context than just Renoir's work alone, putting it in conversation with these other depictions of modern society and how these artists were experiencing it in their own lives during this transformative period. And so this also opened up new opportunities to expand the presentation of the work through some of the archival materials that the curatorial team here at Singapore pulled together, which I think Phoebe will touch on a little bit more in a minute. And then the second example I'd like to highlight is the work of Camille Pissarro and how we featured his work both in Melbourne and then here in Singapore in different ways. Camille Pissarro is one of the key members of the Impressionist group. He was about a decade older than many of the other artists who were kind of part of the inner circle. And so he served as a mentor-like figure to many of them at different points. He was the only artist to participate in all 8 of the exhibitions organized by the Impressionists and was a really deeply committed member of the group. He mostly lived in rural areas out in the countryside, and so he became best known for his depictions of rural scenes and views of agricultural and farm workers. He was also perhaps the most politically active member of the group, or at least we're more aware through his letters and his writings of his political views more so than any of the other artists. And so many of his political views really underscore some of his depictions of these agricultural themes that focus so heavily on kind of the plight of the rural worker. So both in Melbourne and then here in Singapore, we've highlighted this role of him as a mentor and a leader within the group by juxtaposing his paintings, like you can see here at center, along with those of other artists who worked alongside him in a mentor, kind of mentee capacity at different points. And so while he had this mentor-like role to many of his peers, at the same time, he had a very non-hierarchical view of the relationship of artist or teacher and student. And so he likewise was very open to experimentation and learning from his peers and even younger artists. So he was particularly open to exploring the new developments of Neo-Impressionism, a style of painting that was developed by Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. And so it was in the mid-1880s and early 1890s that Pissarro really embarked on a neo-impressionist style in his own work. This was a technique also called pointillism, in which he juxtaposed tiny dots of pure color to create these optical effects when you view them from a distance. And so in Melbourne, Pissarro also featured heavily in a dedicated section of prints, along with some examples by Degas and Mary Cassatt as well, as these 3 artists had collaborated on a ultimately unrealized publication focused on experimental printmaking. And so while Pissarro was very open to experimenting in his painting, he was also one of the most experimental printmakers out of the group. And this slide here is showing our display of those prints that were at the National Gallery of Victoria. And so you might notice the rather unusual display in terms of the wall colors here, this kind of lilac purple walls, this bright yellow molding. But in fact, this is based on what Pissarro himself chose for the display of his works at the 1880 Impressionist exhibition. And not only did he choose these very bold wall colors, but he also just wanted to frame the prints in yellow mats with purple frames, as you can see described by a critic who was responding to the display of these works at that 1888 show. And so Pissarro had a really original and unique vision on how not only to be experimental in his printmaking, but also how to utilize kind of the design and display of his works in really innovative ways. And so that kind of historical context of his work was really highlighted quite visibly in the display in Melbourne. And so while the overall group of paintings that we showed at Melbourne and now here in Singapore are largely the same, one key difference is the group of works on paper, the prints. Prints are, of course, very light sensitive, and they can only be displayed for limited lengths of time. So we needed to find an alternative selection of prints to show here in Singapore, since the ones in Melbourne had already reached their exposure limits. So we were able to draw upon the deep holdings of the MFA's Prints and Drawings department to find an alternate group of works by Pissarro to show here. And so alongside the paintings that I showed previously, the section of prints also focuses heavily on his agricultural views of village market scenes, which highlight some of his political leanings as well. So this group of prints really highlights his experimental approach to printmaking. This is just one example of a group of 3 prints of a woman emptying a wheelbarrow. We have 3 different states of the print on view in the exhibition upstairs. And so you can see over the course of working on each state of the print, he adds different textures and effects building upon the previous version. So at the example at far left, which is the earliest state shown, it almost looks like a late fall or winter scene, the bare branches of the tree. And then by the one on the far right, which is the 8th state, the trees and the bushes have become lush and full of foliage, and he's really added this wonderful texture and interesting effects in how he inked the surface of the plate as well to create a really different visual effect. So these are just a couple examples of how we've reshaped specific areas, specific groups of works for this display here in Singapore. And so I'm hoping that the narrative and the design are really both informing each other in different ways to provide this really distinct experience here for visitors in Singapore. And now I will pass it over to Phoebe for her section.
Thank you so much, Julia. And I must say that asking the curatorial team of another museum to completely alter the narrative of their show, but with the same artwork list, it's a huge ask. And I really want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the MFA for being such an extraordinary partner in this and showing such intellectual generosity to allow us to have a special presentation of the exhibition in Singapore. And I think to also consider the Impressionists in a new way that can make it as meaningful as possible in our context. So every time we bring in a traveling exhibition to the gallery, we do think about, what is the reason that this particular subject should be seen here in Singapore now? And as the Impressionism project developed, of course, that was on our mind as well. So there's always the reason that Impressionism is wildly popular. People are drawn to the beauty of the works. But we had also started to think about, what is it about Impressionism that can still really speak to us today about, underlying concerns that we still have? And generally speaking, we settled around this idea of modernity, that the Impressionists, as Julia has already described, lived in this extraordinarily tumultuous time in the second half of the 19th century. And it was a time period that laid the framework for many aspects of modernity that we still experience. Changes in the nature of labor and work, industrialization and urbanization, environmental change, changing social relations in private and in public, including around gender. All of these things are somehow innately present in the work of the Impressionists because they were so committed to painting the experience of life as it unfolded around them. So we had these kind of key ideas about what we could bring out of the Impressionist works to make the experience of the exhibition new, and in some ways to try to recapture the radicalism of that modern moment. We're so familiar with the Impressionists now. Their works are very widely reproduced. We kind of consume the image of Impressionism in a nostalgic way. You can buy a tea towel of Impressionist work, almost anywhere you go. So how to kind of come back to that sense of what was like really striking and new in that modern time. And I think one of the things to note about the way that the Impressionists respond to modernity is that it's not really didactic or narrative. I don't think you can look at Impressionist work and feel like you're being told what to think about this modern experience. And that's because the Impressionists kind of painted experience as an end in itself, or painted sensation as an end in itself. I've always loved this particular understanding of modern art from the writer Marshall Berman. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read it now, because I think it's really relevant to this point. So Berman describes modernism as an amazing variety of visions and ideas to make men and women the subjects as well as the objects of modernization, to give them the power to change the world that is changing them, to make their way through the maelstrom and make it their own. And I really love this, the idea that art can make you the subject instead of the object of modernization. Not someone that change is just happening to, but someone who is kind of participating and processing that change. And so that sort of lightness in which Impressionists confronted modernity also seems to be really reflective of that. The commitment to paint what they saw, the commitment to paint what was around them also means that they bear witness to this modernity and in some ways grapple with it too. So obviously here at National Gallery, we don't look after our own collection of Impressionism. We're not specialists in Impressionism. So coming to the project, of course, we had to rely heavily on the generosity of Julia and her colleague Katie Hansen at MFA Boston and their deep expertise in Impressionism. But the curatorial team here, which was myself, Alexis Chen, and Celine Ho, somewhere in this audience, we also did some work to help support Julia's narrative for the show and to try and make this point about the modern as tangible and kind of immediate for viewers as we could. So that's what I'm going to share about today. So as you can see throughout our exhibition design, we really decided not to use any period features of the 19th century because we really wanted viewers to have that sense of the presence now of these same concerns, these same ideas, and be able to feel something very direct in their connection to Impressionism. And we had the feeling that if we focus too much on the 19th century setting, maybe there'd be a kind of boundary between the viewer and that experience. So instead, the approach we took was to find some kind of interesting archival and photographic support about the periods in which the Impressionists were working, and to blow these up on a large scale. So they're almost like a little bit immersive in the space. Sometimes they're also projected, so that you could kind of sense the relationship between the work and context in a quite visual way. And frequently this was to do with changes to the landscape as it was emerging in the late 19th century. So for instance, in this example, the exhibition begins with the painters of a prior generation to the Impressionists, the artists of the Barbizon school, who had gathered near the village of Barbizon in the forest of Fontainebleau to paint nature en plein air. So this was a movement that privileged to quite an unprecedented degree, painting in the open air and beginning to embrace the sort of sketchy, slightly unfinished quality of plein air painting, even in the finished work. So both of these things were ideas that the Impressionists would take much further, but that had their seeds in this earlier period of the Barbizon school. So you can see in our presentation how there are aspects of photography that are included in the exhibition design. And we did this deliberately to help contextualize the moment of modernity of the Fontainebleau school artists. So these are photographs blown up from original mid-19th century sources by photographers like Gustave Legray or Eugène Cuvelier, who were likewise active in the forest of Fontainebleau. So when we look at these paintings, you get this extraordinary sense of the tranquility of the forest, all of the beautiful details that the artists convey about nature. But the fact that artists could even come to that forest was itself indicative of modernity. They tended to come in much larger numbers because of the railways that were newly connecting artists in Paris or other parts of France to this site. They could paint outdoors because paint in a tube appeared for the first time in the 1840s to allow you to easily carry your paint with you. And as the artists came to know the forest, they also experienced the fact that modernity was changing it. So the forest of Fontainebleau had started to be logged, roads and paths were being cut through the forest. There were so many visitors that actually Fontainebleau is the site for the world's first marked hiking trails. So the idea that you would come according to a prescribed map through the forest and have markers of your path, something that we really know now from a kind of the managed nature that we encounter, but it was already apparent here in the mid-19th century. And some aspects of this appear in the 19th century photography as well. So one of the artists we highlight in this section is Theodore Rousseau, whose passion for the forest was really significant. He even came to live there for quite a long period towards the end of his life. And he became so devoted to the forest that he advocated for it to be preserved, advocated to the government for it to be preserved as a national preserve. And in 1861, he was successful. The French government made parts of the Fontainebleau forest into a national preserve, and essentially this was the world's first national park. So there's a very interesting dynamic between what we see in the images, which is the ideal of unspoiled, pristine nature, and the story of modernity behind it, which is that this is the moment that nature is coming to be managed, coming to be protected by intervention. We can get a similar sense of some of these changes when we look at the water landscapes of the Impressionists. And of course, this is such a wonderful subject to show because the Impressionists love painting water. I mean, they were kind of masters of water par excellence. It was such an opportunity to show expressive brushwork or attention to atmospheric effects. But at the same time, the water landscapes, whether the coastlines or the riverscapes of 19th century France, were also changing very dramatically. For coastal areas of Normandy in the north of France, such as those painted by Eugène Boudin and Claude Monet, this was an especially marked transition. In the earlier part of the 19th century, the coast of Normandy was occupied by people who made a living from the sea, mostly people who made a living from fishing. By the mid to late 19th century, it had become the pleasure ground of bourgeois Parisians on holiday. And part of this was to do with the modern railway system, but the art historian John House argues it was also because this time period was the time of the invention of the modern holiday, the idea of time away from home as modern organized leisure. So the beach holiday, something that, again, is a familiar trope in our own lives, getting away to the beach, this idea was invented in the 19th century at this time. And it had a huge impact. So here in the show, we juxtapose this beautiful painting by Boudin with some of the 19th century posters advertising the Normandy beach resort of Trouville. So in 1830, Trouville had a population of 2,000 people. By 1886, its local population had grown, but it was receiving an annual influx of 20,000 visitors from Paris, which was 4 times the local population. So again, a beach town that is suddenly flooded by wealthy visitors from a neighboring city, something, again, where I think in Southeast Asia we know this phenomenon very well as well. And in Boudin's landscape, he captures this moment so eloquently, the idea of fashionable figures on the beach. So he was a painter who embraced plein air painting, a contemporary of the Impressionists and a mentor to the young Monet. So he's concerned for the atmospheric effects of the sky in the painting. You can see his attention to the color, the cloud. But also we see in the foreground, parallel to the picture plane, this array of people lavishly dressed for a beach holiday with their up-to-the-minute fashions. Boudin himself was from the Normandy coast, from the town of Honfleur, and he painted these scenes of Parisian on holidays for a number of years through the 1860s. But by the late 1860s, he was kind of disaffected with this subject, and he wrote that he was no longer interested in, quote, painting the idle rich. And we can see in his later work a greater attentiveness to the coastal effects of sea, sky, the shoreline. And similarly, Monet, returning to Trouville in the 1880s, Monet himself had grown up in this area of Normandy and then returned there later in life on a painting expedition. In Monet's version of the coast, we also don't see what we see in the posters and the photographs, the hotels, the casinos, the bathing pavilions, the tourists. He chooses to focus on this rugged moment in nature, the isolated shrub that's being battered by the wind on this coastline. So I wonder as well if we can see in these paintings, and again, this is an interpretation, but part of the rejection of modernity as well, in much the same way as when we take a picture on holiday, we try not to photograph all the other tourists who are there with us. We frame so that the experience of nature is somehow preserved. So modern leisure was one aspect of this change in the waterways of France. But industrialisation also altered the way that people experienced waterways, including rivers. And in this section of the exhibition, we have a set of riverine landscapes by different artists associated with the movement, which also give a sense of how labour, industrialisation, modern environmental change were also affecting these landscapes. So here we can see two works by Alfred Sisley, one of which is shown in the exhibition. From 1880 to 1889, Alfred Sisley lived in a small town that was at the confluence of the Seine and Loing rivers. And he wrote that he was really enamored of this waterway, its beautiful rippling effects. And we can see in his work the way that he was so attentive to capturing the dappled play of the water, the effects of the sky. But also latent in the work are hints of this changing function of the waterway. So in the work that's in the exhibition, you can see there's a barge banked up against the side of the river, and in the distance, the arching Paris-Lyon railway viaduct is interrupting the waterway. In 1881, Sisley wrote to Monet, "Work has been carried out on the canal. Trees cut down, quays built, banks straightened." And indeed, even the idea of a river with a straight bank is something that emerges from the modern period when this was done deliberately so that the river would be more navigable, deeper, to allow trade, to allow kind of more functional work along the river. For this section of the exhibition, we added this image. So it's a different part of the river. It's not the part of the river that Sisley paints. It's part of the Seine closer to Paris. And what you can see in the foreground are piles of sand. And actually, sand was being extracted very comprehensively from the Seine during this period, part of the efforts to make the river deeper and more usable. But the sand was also a valuable commodity in itself for the nearby construction boom in Paris. So we have a very interesting essay about this in our catalogue by the emerging scholar of Impressionism, Geneviève Westerby, who's written about Impressionism's relationship with environmental and ecological change. And one of the points that she highlights is to do with the image of sand extraction, which appears across a number of Impressionist works. And you can see on the screen this example by Sisley, not shown in our exhibition, where the extracted sand occupies the foreground of the image. So to me, this was a very striking and resonant image here in Singapore, a place where we know our own landscape has been reformed by modernity over and over again, kind of shifting edges of the water, and the process of land reclamation, which also extensively uses sand, the continuing issues to do with sand mining across Southeast Asia. And it was striking to me that, as Geneviève points out in her essay, in fact, the Seine was mined to exhaustion of its sand at this time in the 19th century. And this is just another interesting photographic comparative that we found. So this is Sisley's waterworks at Mali, which is on display actually in the section of the exhibition about the first Impressionist exhibition in the 1870s plein air movement. But here's a photograph beside, similarly from a similar period, showing the same section of the river. And what's depicted in Sisley's very charming and picturesque scene is actually a hydraulic pumping station. And it's the station that provided all of the water for the fountains in Versailles. So it had existed for some time before and then was remade to be kind of more effective as a pump in the 19th century. So it's actually an image of a kind of piece of 19th century water engineering on this river. So aside from the rural, agricultural, water landscapes, Julia's already mentioned about the transformation of Paris. And to make this really tangible in the exhibition, we included some of these extraordinary photographs. So these are photographs of one particular site in central Paris, the area around the Place de l'Opéra and the Boulevard Haussmann, that show the extent of destruction of the urban fabric and radical change to the cityscape that took place at this moment. And you can see from the dates of the photographs just how kind of rapid this transformation was. And we use this to allow people to enter the Modern Encounters section with this kind of idea of change in mind. So Julia has already mentioned the Dance at Bougival, Renoir's Dance at Bougival, a very sensual painting in many ways. And Renoir, I think we can understand him as a really consummate painter of sensuality and of modern pleasure. And that's what this painting conveys as well. For us, we wanted to make the slightly less respectable undercurrent of the work more apparent for the visitor. Because I think if we look back at this painting in 21st century eyes, we might kind of notice the 19th century fashion, the practice of dancing in a couple. It looks a little bit old-fashioned. But there's also something about this painting that is still speaks to us about the pleasures of urban life. So you can notice that the dancers are dancing on a ground which is littered with cigarettes and used matches. The friends in the image behind them are kind of drinking a glass of beer, and one of the women is leaning forward on the table. It's not a ladylike posture. The site itself is an area on the outskirts of Paris, a suburban area, Bougival, which at the time was a place where Parisians could go to enjoy themselves. They had kind of open-air restaurants along the Seine and a regular boaters' ball, a bal des connotiers, which is what's advertised in the posters that we hung above the work of art. And I think the posters convey in a very different way what is the nature of this setting. They're much more risque, much more colourful, and they have information about how Parisians could get back to the city late at night, how to get home after they had their fun. So I think this makes it kind of somehow tangible that what we're witnessing is a painting of pleasure. And on that note, I've always have been struck by a phrase by the art historian Stephen Eisenman about the way that the Impressionist ideas of modern social life and modern pleasure have stayed with us. And he writes, "The modern bourgeois world, it may be claimed with only slight exaggeration, has modelled itself upon the aspect of Impressionism." And what he means is that it's almost like there's a template from the Impressionists about how we picture what the pleasures of modern urban life are supposed to look. And it's a template that's perhaps been picked up in kind of advertising, in popular culture, in the leisure industries, and just the way we imagine the pleasures of urban life. Finally, one other site of modern bourgeois pleasure, and quite often urban pleasure, that emerges in the exhibition is the racecourse. Horse racing had only become a vogue in France in the 19th century. And what I love about the two works by Degas that appear in this exhibition is that they're not really about the race at all. They're not a horse painting like an English painter might paint. They're paintings of seeing and being seen in public. So the top painting is of a friend of Degas, and we see the friend, he's paused in his carriage, and he's looking down at his wife and the wet nurse who's feeding his baby. And it's such a sort of striking, intimate family moment, but captured in the open social space of the racecourse. Again, showing the Impressionist radicalism, because this is not a subject matter that would have been considered acceptable, for instance, to show at the annual Salon exhibition. It's really a an unfiltered, in a way, moment from life. And frankly, to anyone in the audience who's ever tried discreetly breastfeeding in public, there is also something very awkwardly familiar about this image. This poor wet nurse is struggling with the child. Everybody is looking at her. The child's mother, the child's father, the family dog is sitting on the back of the carriage looking at her. So again, I mean, there's just this really tangible moment in the life of modernity. And then on the bottom, the image that we see is the racecourse at Longchamp, which is on the outskirts of Paris, built in 1857, a new site for horse racing and also public display. And Degas chooses the parade of horses. So it's about being seen, and you almost get a sense of the kind of prancing of the horses, the jockeys in their colored silks, the kind of pleasure of being seen in public. So another way that we can kind of convey the sense of this modern social space that's latent in the Impressionist works. And in the exhibition, it's a little bit difficult to see in the space, but these images are part of the cluster that hangs above the work, so they're kind of oriented towards the wall on which the works are hanging. And again, they're a little bit later in time, they're from the 1890s, but you can see the crowds at the Longchamp racecourse. And I love the top image because you really see people from all walks of life, everyone from a kind of cloth cap wearer to a top-hatted wearer, top-hatted gentleman, kind of bundled together in this social space. And then again on the bottom, a really striking resemblance to Degas' composition, the prancing racehorses and jockeys before the race begins. So finally, I wanted to mention the ateliers, which are the learning zones dispersed through the exhibition. So this was something quite special that we did for this exhibition in particular, and it was a collaboration between the curatorial and the learning and education teams of the gallery. And it came out of a discussion about how was the best way to connect Impressionism to the modern art of Singapore and Southeast Asia. And for me, I was very reluctant to include any Singapore or Southeast Asian art directly in the exhibition because I felt that trying to accommodate those works under the rubric of Impressionism didn't really do them justice. That kind of labeling them with the name of a European movement didn't really capture the diversity of stylistic references, the different and kind of unique developments of modernism in this region. So I was very reluctant to do that. But at the same time, we do know that artists in this region looked at Impressionism, that it was a reference point for different reasons at different times across Singapore and Southeast Asia. So what we focused on in the learning zone was different aspects of Impressionist working practice. And that was quite deliberate to think about working practice instead of style, because it means you can focus on what people did rather than what the end result looks like. And one of the key practices we thought was painting on plein air, which we do see popping up in different parts of Southeast Asia. So Atelier 1 tells the story of plein air painting in Vietnam, how it was transferred there during the French colonial period as part of the education system, and then how it was taken up and used by the artists in different ways, including during the Vietnamese Revolution. And then the second atelier, we look at Georgette Chen, who was beloved Singapore painter, but also quite a enthusiastic plein air painter. And her letters, photographs of her, show how enthusiastically she took up the practice. And it was one of the ways in which she made herself at home in the world that she was in, that she kind of came to terms with a new place. She lived in many different parts of the world. So this is more of a hands-on station, so visitors can come, and I encourage you all to have a go. You can do some plein air looking out to the Padang. And then finally, the third station looks at printmaking technique. And as we had the special focus on Pissarro in the exhibition, which Julia described, showing these kind of new experimental techniques pioneered by the Impressionists, and the fact that they contributed to the idea of printmaking as a modern medium, as an artistic medium in its own right, not a means of reproducing drawing and painting, but a means that had its own material qualities for expression. And we can see that that idea has had a long legacy as well, including in Southeast Asia by artists who took up kind of serious study of print, such as Lim Yu Kwan. So I think I'm going to leave it there for now, and I hope that you've all had a chance to visit the exhibition. Okay, so we're going to have a discussion about some kind of background to the exhibition and the field of Impressionism, and then we'll open to the floor for your questions. So my first question for Julia is, you've now been working at the MFA for 12 years. And I was wondering, that the field of Impressionist research changes so much. And I wanted to ask you, how has this research changed in the time that you've been working at the museum? What kind of new interests have you seen, and has it affected how the museum approaches acquisitions or exhibitions of Impressionism?
Yeah, absolutely. The literature, the research on Impressionism is vast. It's been a subject of art historical research almost since it was being painted. So there's vast archives of materials and literature to draw upon now for 150 years. So things have definitely changed in recent history as, cultural and social ideas have shifted in our own contemporary lives. One thing in particular that I've noticed a lot in recent years is there's a lot more attention given to some of the some of the figures that are not the key players in the movement. So, of course, we still love Monet and Renoir, and they're still, often highlighted in major exhibitions around the globe at major museums, and we've highlighted them in our own exhibitions as well. But there's also a lot more attention being given to some of the adjacent figures who were very much active and part of the movement. So some artists that are not really as much of a household name today, but were equally important at the time that all of these artists were working together. So artists like James Tissot, who was a British artist, but he was very close friends with Degas, and he lived in Paris, although he was British. And so there's a major exhibition at the Orsay and in San Francisco several years ago, really highlighting his contributions to the moment. And so artists like that are they were really central to the kind of contemporary movement at the time these artists were painting, but now we're perhaps lesser known on kind of a global scale. And that also goes a lot for many of the women artists who were important during that time. So while the Impressionist artists, they were very progressive in a lot of ways, opportunities for women artists were still very limited in the late 19th century. So there were only 4 women who exhibited with the Impressionists in all 8 of their exhibitions. So artists like Morisot and Cassatt were the most significant participants in their exhibitions. But turning more of an interest towards many of these female artists and their role in the time that these artists were painting has been much more of a focus for us, especially in our acquisition priorities at the MFA. So as you may have seen already in the exhibition, or you'll soon see if you're going to see it later today, there's a fairly recent acquisition in the show by the artist Victorine Meurent, who's better known as Edgar Manet's favorite model in the 1860s. So she posed for his rather infamous painting Olympia, which was shown at the Salon in 1865. But she was actually an artist in her own right. And so she had a fairly successful career, and so she's an artist that we've been looking at for a number of years, and then kind of fortuitously a work by her, a self-portrait, appeared in a flea market in Paris several years ago, and we were fortunate enough to be able to acquire it for the collection and include it in the display here in Singapore. So trying to find these kind of hidden moments where these people were, very active at the time and sometimes kind of as the years go by, get forgotten in some ways. And then one other thing I shared with Phoebe the other day is that just this past spring, which it was too late to be able to include this work in the exhibition this fall in Singapore, but I found a painting by Marie Bracmond, which has now joined the MFA's collection. She was one of the 4 women who exhibited with the Impressionists, and so she's another female artist that we've long wanted to acquire, but her work was very limited on the market until quite recently, when there was a large sale from her, the estate of her descendants. And so there's been some more works coming up for sale in recent years. So that was a really exciting addition to be able to represent another member who was a really key player in the Impressionist exhibitions. I guess I'll turn the questions to you now. So I know a lot of, working on an Impressionist show was a new venture for you, since this isn't part of your permanent collection here. But in preparing the exhibition, what were some of the biggest new discoveries for you or surprises you found during the research process?
And I should emphasize that they're only new discoveries for me. I think they're well known in the field of Impressionist scholars, but for me, coming to this research, again, I've had the sort of art historical education that includes Impressionism, but not to the sort of level of depth that required as you prepare an exhibition. So it was really delightful to kind of come back into this body of scholarship. And I must say that the depth and variety of Impressionism scholarship is truly remarkable. I think Alexis and Celine and I, we have files called Impressionist Roads, Impressionist beaches. There's a level of specificity in this body of scholarship that is really extraordinary. But for me, the most interesting discovery was to learn more about the artist Camille Pissarro. And Julia described in her presentation, how Pissarro was such a wonderful mentor to other artists, some of his social values, his social conscience, but that he also manifested this social conscience in his personal and professional relationships as well. He didn't believe in any hierarchies, including the hierarchy of master and pupil. So when he interacted with younger artists of the group, he treated them as equals. Apparently, he applied this to his family life as well. He had many children. Sounds like a nightmare to me, but anyway, he was a person of strong principles. But he also treated his children, with a great deal of kind of freedom and autonomy and a sort of egalitarian perspective. But what I didn't know about him was that he also had a very unusual upbringing. His early life was very distinct from the other Impressionists. His family was French, but he was born in the Danish West Indies, which is now part of the US Virgin Islands. And at the time, it was a Danish colony. So his parents were sort of among a kind of minority European population. In their case, they were also marginal from that population because they were Jewish French merchants. But the majority of the population at that time in the Danish West Indies were enslaved peoples from Africa. And this is where Pissarro grew up until he was sent to boarding school in France at a later age. So he had this kind of very different early experience in a very unequal society. So it makes you wonder how this had informed his later perspectives about equality. And I was struck, I went to the MFA for a research visit to look at the artworks, before as we were finalizing the exhibition plans. And one of the works that we're showing in our exhibition today, Pissarro's Sunlight on the Road in Pontoise, it was actually hanging in the MFA's American section, not in the section where they usually hang French Impressionist paintings. And it was hanging there because of Pissarro's friendship with a Puerto Rican 19th century artist, Francisco Oyer y Cestero, which is my best attempt at pronouncing that. I'm not so familiar with the artist, but I learned from this display that he's a very formative figure in Puerto Rican art history, who had come to Paris and, because of their shared Caribbean roots, had made friends with Pissarro, and they painted together in that environment. So Pissarro's network extended beyond the figures that we know from the Impressionist group into this whole other world. And I thought that was really fascinating and certainly new to me. Yeah. So I mean, for you as well, preparing this iteration of the show, was there something new that cropped up or something that you hadn't focused on so much before that came to the fore for the Singapore version of the exhibition?
Yeah, I think kind of broadly speaking, it was a unique curatorial challenge because we weren't really allowed to change the checklist for Singapore. We were kind of, as I explained, this grew out of an existing partnership with the National Gallery in Melbourne. And so it's kind of a unique challenge, curatorial speaking, to be given a group of works and then have to completely rethink your groupings, your thinking, the stories you're telling with that particular group of artists. Because the show that we sent to Melbourne, I had been working on since more or less 2017. So that show, as it existed in Melbourne, that's how this group of objects has existed in my brain for the past 8 years. So it was really kind of a unique challenge to kind of have to rethink this group of objects, think creatively and innovatively about how we could highlight different stories, different works in different ways. One particular kind of thing we did differently here in Singapore was that while the exhibition ends with this kind of culminating display of Monet's works in this really beautiful kind of immersive room, just focused on Monet's works alone, we've also kind of sprinkled the other paintings by Monet throughout different sections of the show, highlighting them in different contexts with the different themes that are highlighted in different sections. So that was kind of new for me, thinking about his work in context with some of the other artists that we are featuring, because this is also quite different from how we display his work at home in Boston. Since 2016, we've had a dedicated Monet gallery at the museum, and so that's where you will see Monet if you come to Boston. You will see about half of our Monet collection at any given time is on display in this one gallery just focused on Monet alone. So rethinking his work in context with the other painters from the movement was just a new way to display his work than we've been doing recently in our own galleries at home as well.
And that kind of leads me to another question too, which is when you're planning a show like this, I think, every time there's an Impressionist show, there's a lot of audience expectation to see certain artists like Monet, Renoir, Degas. But this show also contains the work of some new figures, people that we might not even realize were associated with the Impressionists. So how do you balance those things? And maybe you can say a bit more about how you chose those other artists to be included.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy to gravitate towards the big names like Monet and Degas, and of course, they have their merit, and there's a reason that they do have those big names today. But I think what's interesting in framing some of the lesser known figures that you'll see in the show, like Jean-Francois Raffaelli, Victor Morant, who I mentioned. I think what's interesting to highlight is that I like to think back, to the moment that these artists were painting these works, to the moment that they started exhibiting together in the 1870s. They were all equals. Monet was not a household name. Nobody knew who any of these artists were. They had really very little impact on the art scene at large until much later. The first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, something like 4,000 people viewed the exhibition compared to 300,000 people that saw the Paris Salon that year. So they had, it really took them years to build up kind of recognition in the art world. And so when they were just starting out, artists like Raffaelli, although he's not as well known today, he was, right there alongside all these other artists and were trying to establish themselves on the art scene. And so I think part of what we've done through a lot of the interpretation is try to highlight kind of the relationships that anchored many of these other figures to each other. So as Phoebe was pointing out, the work by Eugène Boudin, who was a really important mentor to Monet, highlighting some of these relationships and connections between them that formed this network of artists, which was really at the heart of the movement as it was emerging in the 1870s.
And just in case you haven't seen the show or you missed the Raffaelli work. So the Raffaelli work it's an image of a garlic seller, sort of an itinerant seller from the streets of Paris. And I mean, technically, it's not really similar to what we would associate with Impressionism. It's a little bit more realist in its character. And Julia grouped it with the works by Degas, who I think was the person who invited Raffaelli to exhibit with the Impressionists.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, that's a great point. So Raffaelli was really kind of introduced to the group through Degas and their friendship together. And that's another great point to kind of bring up, is that kind of not a misconception, perhaps is too strong a word, but many people assume that, the Impressionists and the works that were shown at the Impressionist exhibition were all of these, beautiful plein air landscapes of, dappled light and vibrant colors. And some of them were, but there was also a great number of artists who participated in the Impressionist shows that painted in a more realist style, like Raffaelli painting kind of urban themes from the city, painting in a much more realist, precise style of painting. So they didn't all paint plein air landscapes all the time. There was a great variety and diversity in terms of the style of painting that you would have seen in the Impressionist exhibitions at the time.
So we're already seeing huge crowds at the exhibition today, and I wanted to ask you, what do you really hope that people take away from the exhibition in Singapore?
Well, I hope everyone has a chance to see the show soon if you haven't seen it already. But I think in taking in this exhibition, I hope that everyone will, take the time to really look closely and pause and really appreciate the opportunity to be in person with these works of art. 150 years after they were made, they still speak to us on such a personal level. I think you'll notice that if you haven't seen, many Impressionist works in person before, they're meant for kind of a one-on-one interaction. They're small scale works. They're made on a domestic scale to be hung in kind of normal middle class, upper middle class homes. They're not, grand wall-sized murals meant for palaces or, castles like works of previous generations of artists. But they were really meant for and painted for people to live with in their homes on a daily basis. So I think you can really form a personal connection with these works and kind of embrace the beauty of how these artists capture these moments of the everyday, and finding these small moments of beauty in your own life is something that I always, to have such appreciation for in these works. And I could turn the question back to you if you have a response as well.
I don't think I have anything really to add to that. I feel like the show does really demonstrate that there's something to be gained from an encounter with the real work. And I hope that that's something that the visitors can feel when they visit the show too. All right, well, I think we can turn to the floor in case you have any questions for me or for Julia. Lynette has a mic.
My question was about the prints. You mentioned earlier that some of the prints were not available due to exposure, and I was curious about what that meant, because I don't know that much about prints.
Yeah, sorry, I can't see where you are, but right there. Okay. Hi. Yes. So prints like etchings or aquatints, lithographs, they're all works made on paper, and so paper like you have in your everyday life, if you leave it sitting out in the sun for weeks on end, it will fade. So it's just like the papers that the Impressionists were printing on are also light sensitive. So as a museum, our goal is to preserve these works for as long as humanly possible. So we really have strict limits on how often we can display a particular work on paper. So typically we'll only allow them to be on display about 6 months every 5 to 10 years, depending on the specific medium. And so since the prints that we showed in Melbourne had already been displayed briefly back in 2021, and then were on display again this June, we had to find a different group to show here in Singapore.
I think we have someone in the middle. Is it Tina? Yep. Thank you very much for the presentation, and the show is fantastic, so well done and congratulations. And I really loved the bit about setting the context of Impressionism and the reference to the Barbizon school. But I wanted to get your views on the influence of other artists such as Constable and Turner, since we know that some of these Impressionists travelled to London during the Franco-Prussian War, were influenced by what they saw in London. And we also know that Constable, of course, was painting a lot on plein air as sketches, not as finished works, and that he often annotated those works with the very things about atmosphere, light, weather, conditions, etc. And I'm just wondering what level of influence you think that they may have had in terms of effects of light, for instance, in the way Turner painted, as well as, of course, the Barbizon artists.
Yes, absolutely. Great question. Yes, a number of artists traveled to London in the early 1870s. Monet and Pissarro both went there during the Franco-Prussian War to escape France during that turbulent period. And we know that they saw exhibitions of works by both artists in London. So there's definitely impact of both artists, and I think Turner in particular, but Constable's work was well known, through print reproductions and otherwise. So his work was definitely known and apparent to many of these artists, and so he definitely was a significant factor. And very similarly to some of the Barbizon school artists who are in the kind of first section of the show. Yes, I mean, there's definite known influences between them, and I don't recall if there were any Turners available in Paris yet at that point, or if they were really only in English collections. But there's some great connections that you can draw between Monet and Turner, for sure.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, and maybe you can confirm, Julia, that also one of the reasons for the Barbizon School to be there in the show it's to do with the technique, definitely. But if you read the labels, there's a lot of personal connections between those artists. I mean, in some situations, the Impressionists early in their careers were painting alongside the artists of the Barbizon School, or kind of learning from them very directly.
Yes, definitely. So we know there were personal connections and friendships and relationships between the young Impressionists and the older generation of some of the Barbizon artists. Like Renoir talked about meeting Diaz de la Peña in the forest of Fontainebleau, and Diaz really encouraged Renoir to lighten his palette and use brighter colors. And so there were known instances of direct influence and mentorship between the two schools.
To me, that story also shows that the forest was crowded. If you could just run into another artist there.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic sharing. It was, the exhibit is also excellent. In particular, I really resonated with your belief that, Impressionism is not very didactic. It doesn't really tell you what to choose. And I find that same belief, in the photographs specifically that, are exhibited in the exhibit. But, of course, since this is about Impressionism, I want to ask whether these photographs are meant to purely supplement the paintings, or perhaps in like a view of Pissarro, his non-hierarchical view of learning. Perhaps are these two mediums equal in each other in this gallery to inform each other?
I have to say honestly that in this exhibition they are not, which is not to say that we don't think that they have equal status as art forms in general. But this was a show that was developed around a corpus of Impressionist paintings, and we used the photographs really as kind of supplemental context to bring out the work of the artists. But interestingly, I think that there is a very rich show that could be done about these kind of confluences between Impressionism and photography, and it would take a kind of much deeper effort into the histories of photography than we've made for this. So I must confess that there are contextual supplements here, but those photographers featured, especially in the Fontainebleau section, were pioneering photographers in their own right. And there has been very interesting research about them at Fontainebleau, published in previous exhibition catalogues.
Hi, hi. Thanks for putting together the show and your fascinating insights. So my question is about the style of Impressionism. Is it still a living, breathing way of painting, or has it really like percolated into the whole, I don't know, Western art world, such that it's no longer considered a style, a distinct style, but a way of painting? So in other words, can we identify any living artist who could be considered an Impressionist artist as it stands, I mean, currently? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I think Impressionism, of course, kind of has entered our consciousness on a broader level now, since it's, you know, such a known part of art history, and these figures are so kind of well known worldwide. But there's certainly still artists today that work and emulate this type of style of painting. I know, you know, just speaking in terms of like locally in Boston, I know there's, you know, local groups of plein air, you know, watercolorists and local art societies that kind of fashion themselves as, you know, Impressionist style artists. And just kind of as a point to make a distinction in terms of when we're talking about Impressionist, you know, it's now, the term is now used to describe this style of painting of, you know, the loose brushwork and the bright colors and whatnot. But it's not really, you know, at its core meant to be a stylistic descriptor, since we really talked about the Impressionists as this group of artists exhibiting together. And as I was mentioning before, many of them, in fact, did not paint in what we now call an Impressionist style. So there's really great diversity in their approaches. But yes, I think today there's certainly still lasting influence in terms of that overall approach and kind of the way that they developed their approach to painting.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so fascinating to journey through this process with you. And if I could bring away back from the art to the curative process, I was just wondering, what were the main impetuses for recurating something that might have been you know, complete at 2017? From just a quick takeaway from your sharings, it seems like the Melbourne version was maybe more visceral. You could actually like feel it like a salon, and here in Singapore, maybe more analytical. Is that something which is thought to be perhaps more relevant to the audiences here, or were there some other thought processes behind? Thank you.
Well, I think the shows were different in two ways. I mean, as Julia described, the Melbourne show also, it wasn't just to do with the design, but it had a different curatorial narrative as well, and much more focused on the relationships between groups of artists and artists at specific points in their careers. And their design also reflected that, because it was looking back historically at the moments when the artist developed in specific ways. I think, I mean, from the point of view of National Gallery Singapore, our reason for doing it was to try to connect in a more visceral and immediate way with people's experience today, because we felt that there was something, well, partly it was because we've done an Impressionism exhibition before, which was already in some sense an introduction to the movement. So we wanted to have a take on the exhibition that would be new, but that could also say more than, you know, the idea that Impressionist works are beautiful, or, you know, there's something kind of visually compelling about them. We really wanted to give the audience something to connect to that was based on their own experience of modern life. So that was the main reason for doing that. And I must say that it is quite rare to be able to do this with an exhibiting partner. So there's there's different models for how traveling exhibitions work. And sometimes they work by traveling exactly as they are, you know, word by word, work by work, exactly as they are. So the opportunity to have this sort of intellectual engagement about where an exhibition is going to, what it should say at each place, how it should be designed, I think this is very special. And Julia and I are both, very excited and challenged by the process, but I think it's also a wonderful curatorial opportunity.
Yeah, I think we are very lucky as audiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe and Julia, for sharing.